Hey guys, this is Fiction Life. How are you all? Please support to subscribe this channel for watching new interesting stories. So in this video, we will see second part, what if Harry embraced godly power to face Voldemort. Here is short summary. Harry discovers and embraces a godly power, unlocking abilities beyond imagination to prepare for his final battle with Voldemort. Will this newfound strength be enough to ensure victory? But before we start, if you want more stuff like this, then be sure to subscribe and like this video. And if possible, share this video with your friends. Now let's start the story. Finally, after a long moment, Harry walked over to Neville and placed a hand on his shoulder, saying, "I'm sorry, Neville." The words sounded weak and hollow as soon as they left his mouth, but he knew there was nothing else he could say. Neville looked over his shoulder and shook his head. "You did all you could. Thanks for coming, for saving me." Harry just nodded his head. "They put up anti-Portkey wards," Neville stated as he turned back to his Gran. "We tried to escape using your Portkey, but," he trailed off and reached out to grip her hand. Harry turned away for a moment, but he did not want to leave his friend alone. Neville needed his friends now more than ever. He stood by Neville's side and gave his shoulder a comforting squeeze as his friend said goodbye to his grandmother, the woman who had raised him. A series of cracking sounds drew his attention, and he turned his head to see Ginny standing over a pile of broken wands. She met his gaze for a moment, and Harry could see the compassion shining in her eyes as she took in Neville kneeling over his Gran. Remus and Tonks came up beside Ginny a moment later, and Harry saw that they had all the Death Eaters bound in ropes and lined up. "We need to send a Patronus to Dumbledore," Remus stated uneasily after a moment. Harry nodded his head and turned back to Neville, giving his shoulder one last squeeze before he let go. Neville leaned down close to his Gran, and Harry looked away to give him a moment of at least semi-privacy. Neville stood a moment later and turned to face everyone. "Ginny," he greeted solemnly, "Professor Lupin, and Tonks." "Tonks," Neville added with a nod. "Thank you." Ginny waved his words away and rushed forward to envelop him in her warm embrace. "I'm so sorry, Neville," Harry heard her whisper. Neville did not reply as far as Harry could hear, but he returned the hug and took a moment to center himself as Ginny stepped back into Harry's side. Harry took her hand in his as he watched his friend struggling with his emotions. "Do you have any relatives you can stay with?" Remus asked when it looked like Neville was back in control. "Well, there's my great-uncle Algy," Neville began. "But I'm not sure that would be a good idea." Harry squeezed Ginny's hand and shared a quick glance with her. She seemed to read his intentions and nodded her head with a small smile. "You can stay with us," he interjected. Neville stopped talking abruptly and turned to Harry with a look of surprise. "I bought a house, and there's a spare bedroom. We never use it. It's yours if you want it. At least stay with us for a few days," Ginny added when Neville did not immediately reply. "You can decide what you want to do for the rest of the summer after that." "Thank you," he stated, and Harry could see that he was feeling overwhelmed at the moment. He just nodded in reply. "Anytime, mate. That's what friends are for." He turned back to Remus and Tonks. "We have to get out of the wards before we can leave, so give us a minute before you call in the cavalry." "What about my Gran?" Neville asked, turning back to look at her body. "Don't worry," Remus replied. "We'll make sure she's taken care of, and we'll be in touch soon so that arrangements can be made." "Thanks, Professor." Remus just nodded as Harry led Ginny and Neville out of the house and beyond the wards. Taking a moment to ensure no one else was around, Harry stated, "Harry Potter lives at 165 Magpie Lane." "What? Just repeat that in your mind," Harry explained. He gripped Neville's shoulder with one hand and still held Ginny's hand in the other as he apparated them all to his home. They arrived home to an anxious group of people who were quite relieved to see them. The festive mood that greeted their return died quickly as the others learned the news about Neville's Gran. Harry gave Neville the quick tour ending at the spare bedroom where Neville would be sleeping. He tried to convince Neville to join the rest of them out in the lounge, but Neville begged off saying he was tired and just wanted some time to himself. Not wanting to push, Harry nodded his acceptance. When he returned to the group, Harry first checked the map for any signs of the two Death Eaters that got away. When he could find no trace of them, Harry settled down on the sofa beside Ginny and with her help gave a brief account of the battle to the others. "Well, this is utterly morbid," Ginny inserted into the silence following their recap. She pulled back from where she was cuddled next to Harry and turned to face him. "I know this probably isn't the right time for it, but you still have a pile of presents to open, and it won't be your birthday for much longer." Harry frowned as he looked from Ginny to his other assembled guests. He fought down his initial instinct to refuse. They had gone to the trouble and expense of getting him gifts. The least he could do was open them. All right. The mood was subdued for a birthday party. Even Fred and George were relatively well behaved, or at least relatively quiet in their shenanigans. Harry thanked them all profusely as they left for the evening with assurances that their training would resume on schedule the next day. When their guests had all left, Harry walked over to the door to Neville's room and hovered for a moment debating whether or not to check in with him before ultimately walking back to the sofa and sinking down next to Ginny. It was always nice to have friends to talk to, but he also knew that he often preferred solitude at a time like this, especially when the wound was so fresh. He would give Neville tonight, if that is what his friend wanted. Tomorrow they would talk. He and Ginny, by unspoken agreement, waited quietly for Tonks and Remus to return. Tonks never did, but Remus eventually turned up. Tonks had to go into the ministry, he explained. It was a bit of a mess to sort out. Much as I hate to admit it, the fact that the Longbottoms are such a prominent pureblood family draws a lot more inquiry than an attack on a Muggleborn or even half-blood would. Harry nodded his head absently. Blood prejudices ran deep in the wizarding world, but it was not the ministry's reaction that he was interested in. "Did you have any trouble with Dumbledore?" Ginny asked. He sank down heavily into the armchair opposite the sofa. "I think he may be suspicious of me, but he didn't say anything about it and didn't ask any questions. The Order has been unofficially trying to keep an eye on your friends' houses, both for their safety and in the hopes of spotting you, so it's possible that he took it as a chance encounter, that we managed to stumble across you as the attack was occurring. He's too shrewd to blindly accept mere coincidence, however, so he likely has deduced I'm in contact with you." Harry just nodded his head. "I sent him a letter a week or so back," Harry told him. He had not previously spoken of the letter to anyone but Ginny. "I haven't heard back yet, but I suppose it's possible that he took some of what I said to heart." "And what did you say?" Remus queried, leaning forward and peering at Harry intently. "A lot," Harry said with a shrug as he struggled internally to form a response. "I called him on a lot of his actions of late and told him I'll be fighting in this war without his help. I said it was about time we started working together instead of wasting our resources trying to counter each other." Remus nodded his head and gave Harry a warm smile. "Ever the optimist," he quipped. Harry rolled his eyes. "Someone has to keep their eyes forward if we're ever going to stop this war." "No one can accuse you of not doing your best to work towards that goal," Remus agreed. Looking around the room he asked, "Where's Neville?" Harry jerked his head towards the bedroom. He wanted some time alone. Remus nodded solemnly. "That was a very good thing you did, offering him a place here. He'll need his friends to get through this." "I know," Harry agreed, running a hand through his hair. "I suppose you would know better than most," Remus acceded. "You and me both," Harry countered. "I should probably get going," Remus stated after a short silence. "I'll stop by tomorrow with an update on the arrangements." "Thanks, Remus," Harry said. "I know Neville will appreciate that." As the door closed behind him, Harry and Ginny slipped almost reflexively into each other's arms. Harry inhaled deeply the flowery scent he had come to associate as uniquely Ginny and squeezed her tightly. "I love you," he whispered and pressed a key to the top of her head. "I love you too, Harry," she replied with a key into his neck. Harry sighed as they held each other for a long moment. He gave a long glance to Neville's door, reaffirming his vow to give him this night. If Neville did not emerge on his own by the time they finished their morning workout, he would just have to go and drag him out. As it turned out, he did not need to oust Neville from his self-imposed isolation. When Harry and Ginny returned from their morning workout, they found him lingering just inside the training room. "All right, Neville," he called. Neville turned around and walked towards them, stopping to lean against the doorway as he seemed to take in their appearance. Yeah, I'm okay. Thank you both for yesterday. I wouldn't have lasted much longer if you hadn't shown up when you did. I'm just sorry the portkey wasn't able to get you out of there, Harry stated. They've been using portkeys themselves to escape, so I figured they wouldn't ward against them. Yours is the first place I've seen where they've done so. You did all that you could, Neville assured him. But how did you know we were under attack? Harry studied him for a moment before jerking his head towards the map on the wall. Those necklaces were more than just portkeys, he explained as he led Neville over to the map. Harry linked them to this map which shows us where they are and also alerts us if the portkey is activated, Ginny supplied from behind them. Quite ingenious, really. Harry looked over his shoulder to meet her gaze for a moment before turning back to Neville. It was really just modified from something my father and his friends made while they were at Hogwarts. It's brilliant, Neville whispered as he studied the names scattered across the country. Ginny smirked triumphantly at him as Harry looked at her. I'm off to shower. Neville waved over his shoulder with his eyes still glued to the map as Harry tracked her progress out of the room. I'm going to get started on breakfast. Make yourself at home, Neville. Neville turned away from the map and held Harry's gaze as he said, Thank you, Harry, for everything. There's no need for thanks, Neville, Harry said, clapping him on the shoulder. I know what it's like to not have anywhere to go. I used to spend my whole summers waiting for the day I'd get an owl from Ron saying I could come to stay with his family. Some people seem to think blood counts for everything, but it doesn't, not really. Some people are blessed with wonderful families. Some of us have to build our own, one step at a time. I never realized things were that bad for you, Neville stated, a faraway look in his eyes. I didn't exactly advertise the fact, Harry responded. Not even to Ron and Hermione, though we were close enough for them to realize that not all was well with my relatives. Neville's gaze refocused on him as he spoke. Gran wasn't the easiest person to grow up with, but, for as long as I can remember, she's been my only family. I know she loved me, but I also know how hard it was to have me around as a constant reminder of my father. Sometimes she found it difficult to separate us. I don't think she was aware of it, but I think deep down she wanted me to be just like my dad, to replace him in her life. Almost like my dad would live on in me or something. That must have been hard, Harry commented, knowing you could never be who she wanted you to be. Neville nodded his head, not meeting Harry's gaze. A heavy silence settled over the pair before Neville asked, Was it like that with your relatives too? The opposite, he replied, shaking his head. They hate magic and anything connected to it. Nothing would have made them happier than if I turned out to be nothing like my parents, a squib without an ounce of magic. Of course, I know now that even that would never have been enough. Even if you had been the exact spitting image of your father, it would never have been enough to fill that void. I know, Neville said, finally meeting Harry's eyes. As much as I wished I could, I realized that it was impossible. We can only be who we are. No more, no less, Harry stated. Feeling the need for a lighter topic, he said, You ever been in a muggle house before? No, he answered with an abrupt shake of his head. I haven't. Come on, then, Harry said, leading him into the kitchen. If you're going to be staying with us, you ought to learn how to operate some of the appliances. I can teach you the basics while I make breakfast. When Ginny rejoined them, Neville was bent over the stove turning one of the burners on and off in fascination while Harry was dishing up their meal. Isn't this amazing? He asked of her. Harry laughed. Yes, muggles are rather ingenious. Now come on, and let's eat already. Harry caught a quick shower after breakfast and settled onto the sofa beside Ginny with a book in his hand. We usually use this time to do a bit of studying, he explained to Neville. I hope you don't mind me asking, Neville started, red staining his cheeks as he paused momentarily. How long have you two been living together? Harry shot a glance towards Ginny to find her looking back at him with her eyebrows raised in surprise, a look Harry guessed was mirrored on his own face. He had never considered what their living situation would look like to an outsider, but now that he thought about it, he could see exactly why Neville was seemingly uncomfortable and curious about it. A few weeks, Harry answered, turning back to Neville. We didn't exactly plan it this way, but some extenuating circumstances arose. He trailed off, looking to Ginny and grasping her hand. And while I regret the events that led her here, I'm quite pleased at how things turned out. Me too, she agreed with a sly smile that slowly slipped from her face. Though I really didn't like what led me here. Harry gave her hand a squeeze and turned back to Neville. I had been planning on getting a house since last summer so that I wouldn't have to go back to my relatives and so that I'd be able to hide from both Dumbledore and Voldemort. Neville nodded his head and cast his gaze about the room. Feel free to check out the shelves, see if anything catches your interest, Harry offered. Remus is supposed to drop by later with an update. Maybe afterward we can go and pick up some of your things, if you want. That sounds good, Neville responded as he wandered over the bookshelves lining the wall next to the map. Harry shared a quick look with Ginny before picking up his book and starting to read. Their studying was interrupted shortly thereafter by a short burst of ethereal song followed by a flash of fire. He jumped off the sofa even as his brain recognized Phoenix song. A fiery bird emerged from the ball of flames and circled the room, trilling softly. Harry held out his arm and the phoenix swooped down to alight gently on the offered perch. "Hello, Fox," Harry greeted. Fox trilled in reply, and Harry took note of the fact that the bird was standing on only one leg. He held out the other to reveal a roll of parchment clasped in his talon. "Thank you," he said, reaching up with his other hand to grab the missive. He dropped the letter onto the sofa to rub his fingers through the phoenix's feathers. Fox gave another trill before launching into the air and disappearing in another burst of flames. "Was that Dumbledore's phoenix?" Neville queried. Harry nodded. "I sent him a letter over a week ago. I'm surprised it took him this long to reply." "But I thought you said he couldn't find you here," his fellow Gryffindor pressed. "Dumbledore can't," Harry explained. "Fox, on the other hand, is another story. I'm not sure whether or not he'd be able to bring the headmaster here, but I suspected he'd be able to find me here or else when I left the house and suggested Dumbledore use him to send his response." "Well, read it and see what he has to say," Ginny inserted, holding the roll of parchment out to him. Harry accepted the letter and sat beside her on the sofa. He held it out in such a way that she could read as well should she wish to do so. "Dear Harry, you have no doubt been wondering when or perhaps if you would receive my reply. I will be honest with you when I say that, upon my first read through your letter, I was shocked at your suggestion that I turn to Fox to deliver this reply when I had on several occasions turned to my friend for aid in finding you, only to be rebuffed time and time again. I was unsure whether he would not or could not help. I now know. He was not impressed when I chastised him for withholding such information from me nor when I demanded he take me to you straight away. I fear for your safety every day. You have proven more than capable of taking care of yourself, this I cannot deny. However, your insistence in rushing to every attack made against one of your students places you in grave danger. I do not doubt these words will fall on deaf ears, but please allow an old man to say his piece. You raised many points in your missive and asked many questions. I fear that any answers I can provide to you will be wholly inadequate, but as you so eloquently stated, we cannot expect to be perfect. All we can do is try. I do not, as you might hope or expect, have a grand design for you. There is no guide to follow on your road to confront Tom. There are no methods I can offer you to guarantee his defeat. I have only suspicions and educated guesses, though, with all false modesty aside, my guesses are far more educated than the average person's. You asked me what power you possess that the Dark Lord knows not, and my answer was love. Love is what saved you from death. Tom has never considered love to be anything but a weakness and never conceived that such a force could stop an unblockable curse. Even now he underestimates the power of love, believing that with your blood flowing in his veins that whatever power your mother's love and sacrifice provided you has been nullified. I believe he is wrong. I believe the power of your mother's love continues to live on in you today, and I believe your own very nature has kept it alive all these years. Despite the similarities shared in your childhoods, you never lost your capacity to love. No, your ability to love, if anything, exceeds that of most your age. You love so fully and completely, and that love empowers you. There is no offensive spell powered by love, it will not provide you a curse capable of defeating Tom. Perhaps it was hopelessly naive of me, but I never intended for you to fight in this war, at least not while you were still a student. I had hoped to prevent Tom from returning at least until you were fully trained. When he returned at the end of your 4th year, I hoped to limit his influence and shield you from the realities of war for as long as possible. I do not need to tell you the extent of my failures. I was unable to convince our world of Tom's return and spent more time fighting political battles with the ministry than I did countering Tom's actions. I failed to keep you informed and left you susceptible to Tom's manipulations. I fear I failed you yet again in sending you back to your relatives last summer. I suspect it did not take you long to come to the decision that I would continue to repeat my mistakes in my treatment of you. I have found myself curious as to how exactly you managed to teach yourself the intricacies of wandless magic in such a short span of time, but now is not the best time for such intellectual inquiries. I will be honest and state that it is still my desire to prevent you from continuing to put yourself in danger by engaging Death Eaters. I also understand that my desires hold little sway over your actions. Moreover, I would be hard-pressed to stop you even if I could find you, and given your recent ascent into legal majority, I would have little ground to act upon. There comes a point in every man's life when he must admit defeat. There are some battles worth fighting to the bitter end. This is not one. Continuing to fight against each other would only further hinder our cause, and you are correct that we can accomplish much more if we work together. The ball, as the youths say, is in your pitch. You know where to find me, yet I have failed utterly in all efforts to locate you. You offered me an olive branch, and it is only fair that I offer the same. I realize my recent actions have left you little cause to trust me, but I offer you my solemn vow that, upon our next meeting, I will do nothing to stop you from returning to your current residence. I hope my word is enough to assuage any doubts you may have about meeting with me. Should you require further assurance, you know where to owl me, otherwise, my door is and always shall be open to you. With my sincerest regards, Albus Wulfric Percival Brian Dumbledore. Harry looked over at Ginny to find her still reading. He turned to find Neville no longer sitting across from them. He must have been distracted while reading the letter. It took only a moment to locate him by his magic in the loo. By the time he turned back to Ginny, she was looking up into his gaze. "What do you think?" Harry frowned as he thought it over. "It sounds like he's coming around." "Do you believe him?" she pressed. "I don't think he's the type of person to break a vow," Harry replied thoughtfully. "I mean, I know it's hard to take him at his word right now, but I don't think he's a bad person. He's just made some poor decisions lately." She nodded her agreement. "I know, and I know how much we need him in the war. I just don't particularly want to have to deal with him myself." Harry gave her a sad smile and squeezed her hand in support. "I can't say I blame you. I'll set up a meeting with him in a few days, and we can take things from there." With that decided, he went back to his reading only to be interrupted again by the arrival of Remus. He had gotten in touch with Neville's great-uncle Algy, who requested Neville's help in setting all the affairs in order. They were planning the funeral service for tomorrow, so Neville decided to stay with his uncle for the evening despite Harry's offer to ferry him back and forth as needed. Harry and Ginny arrived at the funeral early and sought out Neville, wanting to make sure their friend was all right. They found him with 2 wizards and a witch who all appeared to be contemporaries of Neville's gran, and Neville appeared relieved to see them. "Thank you both for coming," he said to them, accepting Harry's handshake and Ginny's hug. "Of course we're going to be here, Neville," Ginny stated. "We're your friends. And you are still coming back with us, aren't you?" Harry added. Neville nodded with a small smile. "Yes, and thanks, again." Harry waved him off. "That's what mates are for. We'll get out of your hair as I'm sure you have things to do." Actually, Neville spoke, causing Harry to pause mid-turn and face him again. "If you don't mind, would you? It's just that, we don't have much family, and, as you can see, no one even near my age," he said, gesturing to the elderly wizards and witches behind him. "It would mean a lot if you'd stay and sit with me during the funeral." "Of course. We're here for you, Neville," Ginny added. "Whatever you need. I appreciate it, more than I can say," Neville replied. Harry smiled, knowing that no amount of denials would stop Neville from showing his gratitude. "Any time, Neville." In truth, Harry felt a little awkward standing with Neville and his few remaining family members as guests began to arrive, but it was a small burden to bear compared to giving his friend whatever support he needed. When he saw a distinctive shock of red hair, though, he began to fear the worst. He knew the time would come when he and Ginny would need to face the rest of her family, but now was not the time for such a potentially volatile meeting. Ron did nothing more than nod his head at Harry as he went to greet Neville. Mrs. Weasley, on the other hand, had eyes only for her daughter. Ginny could do little but brace herself for impact as Molly Weasley rushed forward and swept her into a crushing embrace. Harry met Mr. Weasley's eyes for a moment as he walked toward his wife and daughter, clasping a hand to Ginny's shoulder as she was still enveloped in her mother's arms. When she eventually let go of her daughter, he noticed tears in Mrs. Weasley's eyes. She seemed to take a moment to compose herself before turning her attention on him. She hesitated a moment before drawing him into one of her trademark, bone-crushing hugs. When she stepped back a moment later, an awkward silence settled over the group. Mrs. Weasley took a deep breath as if she was about to speak but stopped when Mr. Weasley laid hand on her shoulder. Now is not the best time for this, but perhaps after the service you two would be willing to talk. Harry turned and met Ginny's eyes for a long moment. He did not need legilimency to read her conflicted emotions. Turning back to her parents, Harry replied, "Of course." Nodding rigidly, Mr. Weasley ushered his wife to their seats, and Ron stepped up in their place. He, too, gave Ginny a tight hug and then held his hand out to Harry. He gripped it without hesitation. "It's a good thing you're doing for Neville," Ron commented, jerking his head towards the boy who was greeting another new arrival. Harry shrugged. "I know what it's like to have nowhere to go and no one to go to." "I reckon you do," Ron replied. "Mum and Dad weren't too bad, were they?" he asked, half turning to include Ginny in the conversation. "No," Harry replied as Ginny glumly inserted, "they want to have a talk after the service." "I'm guessing you don't plan to come home?" Ron asked. When Ginny shook her head, he winced in sympathy. "Mum's gonna flip. She's barely been holding it together since you left." "Yes, well, she wasn't exactly blameless in my leaving in the first place," she retorted. Ron held up his hands in supplication. "Hey, I'm not saying she wasn't. I'm just telling you what to expect." "Thanks, Ron," Harry said. "And thanks for sticking up for me to Bill too." "How'd you hear about that?" Ron questioned. "We, kind of ran into him a couple weeks back," he explained. "Let's just say he hadn't changed his position and that he didn't care what you or the twins thought on the matter." Ron shrugged. "It's not that I enjoy thinking about it, but I trust you. I know you wouldn't do anything Ginny didn't want you to do, and if you tried, she'd probably do far worse to you than I could." "You're probably right," Harry admitted with a smile. "Damn straight he is," Ginny helpfully inserted. "Well, I should probably get back to Mum and Dad," Ron stated. "I'll see you guys after." "Yeah, see you," Harry agreed. "Bye, Ron," Ginny added. With a little wave, Ron turned and made his way to where his parents were sitting, and Harry turned back to Ginny and reached for her hand, interlocking his fingers with hers. There was still the looming conversation following the service, but thus far things with the Weasleys had gone well. Seeing that Neville was not currently occupied, he tugged Ginny's hand lightly and headed towards him. "How did things go with your parents?" he directed at Ginny. She shrugged. "The battle has been postponed until after the service." "Sorry," Neville said in reply. "If it weren't for me." "Honestly, Neville," Ginny interrupted. "You're just as bad as Harry, trying to take responsibility for everything that happens around you. It's not as if I intended to avoid my parents for the rest of my life." "What she's trying to say," Harry added, "is that it's no problem. We want to be here for you. Truth be told, we expected this to happen, with the Weasleys and—" "Dumbledore," Neville interrupted. "Yes," Harry agreed, nodding. "No," Neville stated, shaking his head. He lifted a hand and pointed behind Harry. "Dumbledore is here." "Oh," Harry responded, his thoughts derailed. Slowly he turned around, letting go of Ginny's hand in the process, and met the eyes of his headmaster as the man approached. "Harry, Ginny, Neville," the wizened wizard greeted in turn, focusing his attention on Neville at the last and offering his hand. I'm terribly sorry for your loss, my dear boy. Thank you, sir, Neville responded. It is bittersweet that it is at such times that we are often brought closer to those around us that it comes accompanied with the loss of someone we hold dear, the headmaster intoned. But it is always heartening to find you have friends you can rely on when things are most dire. I couldn't agree more, the boy said, turning his gaze to Harry and Ginny. I couldn't ask for better friends. I dare say these two are unique in that regard, Dumbledore concurred. Again, Neville, you have my most sincere sympathies, and, should you have need of anything, do not hesitate to contact me, and I shall offer whatever aid I can. Thank you, sir, Neville said. Harry was slightly shocked when, with a simple glance and nod in his direction, Dumbledore walked off without another word. He looked at Neville and then to Ginny to find his feelings expressed plainly on their faces. Perhaps he really was sincere, Harry commented after a long moment of silence. Perhaps. Ginny shrugged noncommittally. He did not blame her one bit for being less than charitable towards the headmaster even despite his apparent change in behavior. Were circumstances less dire, he would be much more hesitant to make amends with the man as well. As it was, though, he had little choice, and, at least for the moment, things were looking about as well as they could. It was at that moment that he saw Hermione arrive. He watched her warily, wondering whether fate would allow him to avoid a third consecutive potential confrontation. She approached Neville first and pulled him into a fierce hug. He could hear the whisper of exchanged words, but they were spoken softly enough that he would have had to strain his ears to listen in. After a long moment, Hermione stepped back and gripped Neville's arm briefly before turning in his direction. Harry, she greeted coolly, Ginny. She strode on past without any further ado, and Harry was left momentarily stunned at her frosty demeanor. By his books, he had every right to be upset with her, not the other way around. One glance at Neville, though, and Harry put the matter out of his mind. Now was definitely not the right time to worry about such things. Seamus and Dean arrived together shortly before the service was scheduled to start and found seats beside Ron after greeting Neville. It was only at that point that he realized Hermione was not sitting with the Weasleys. He was unable to give much thought to the matter, though, as it was time for the funeral to begin. He and Ginny followed Neville to the front of the room and seated themselves at his side. Harry had never been to a funeral before, magical or muggle, but he imagined there was probably not much difference between the two. He had never known any witches or wizards to be particularly religious. They celebrated Christmas and Easter, and that was about all he ever saw to signify any sort of religious belief. Nevertheless, a vicar conducted the bulk of the ceremony until family and friends were given the opportunity to speak about the deceased. A couple of Neville's elderly family members spoke briefly about the formidable woman whom they were laying to rest. Dumbledore said a few words about the influence she had held within the ministry and the reforms she had helped to push through in her life. Neville declined to speak, and when no others volunteered, the vicar concluded the ceremony. A procession was formed as they all followed the vicar, who was floating the coffin in front of him, onto the grounds of the manor. After a short walk, they entered a small, family cemetery. A few more words were spoken before the coffin was lowered into the newest grave. The family was called forward to levitate the freshly dug earth back into the hole. The dirt was separated into piles, one for each of the family members to add their piece. Nothing more was said as Augusta Longbottom lay in her final resting place. Gradually, the crowd began to return to the manor. Neville stood rooted beside his grandmother's grave, Harry and Ginny his shadows, not more than 2 paces behind him. Eventually, even the minister and the rest of the family departed. When just the 3 of them remained, Ginny stepped forward and put a hand on Neville's shoulder before turning him and pulling him into a hug. Harry stepped up as she released her embrace and clapped Neville on the shoulder, giving him a reassuring squeeze. "How are you holding up?" He took a deep, steadying breath. "I'm okay," he stated. "It's just," he paused, searching for the right word, "final now, you know." Harry nodded, though he honestly could not exactly relate. While he was no stranger to losing loved ones, he had never buried any of them. He was not sure which was worse. "Do you think you guys could give me a few minutes?" Neville asked after a long moment. Harry shared a quick look with Ginny, and they immediately agreed. "We'll be inside whenever you're ready," he stated before they turned and began the short walk back. Harry kept a focus on Neville's magic as they walked away, wary of leaving him out there alone so soon after the attack. Unsurprisingly, Mr. and Mrs. Weasley were waiting to pounce as soon as they reappeared. They were ushered into a mostly deserted corner of the room. An awkward silence descended over the quartet as nobody seemed eager to begin. Finally, Mr. Weasley cleared his throat as he adjusted the collar of his robes. "Your mother and I owe you an apology," he began, speaking directly to Ginny. "I could offer you any number of excuses as to why we agreed to what Dumbledore proposed, but in the end, we were both aware of what an invasion of privacy we were endorsing, and we did so anyway. While we may have had the best of intentions, that does not excuse our actions. You are our daughter, and our first duty is to protect you, and in that we failed. To the extent that you felt you had to run away from your own home to ensure your own safety." Harry could clearly hear the pain in his voice as he confessed his sins and could not help but feel for the man. Ginny's flight from the burrow had obviously affected him deeply. "We're so sorry, Ginny," her mother pleaded, her regret and sadness written across her face. Ginny gripped his hand tightly at her father's emotional display. Harry squeezed her hand comfortingly, as she cleared her throat and responded. "I forgive you, both of you. I know that you did what you did because you were worried about Harry, and while I do not agree with those reasons, I guess I can understand why you might feel the need to do whatever you could to find him." Mr. and Mrs. Weasley shared a relieved smile at her words. "Molly and I have always viewed you as a part of our family," Mr. Weasley said, turning his attention to Harry. "We have been worried about you ever since you disappeared at the end of term. We don't know what you've been doing since then, or even for the last year, and we don't know why you felt the need to hide your actions from your friends and family. But you're a good man, Harry, with a good heart. I don't know how you knew Ginny was in distress, but when we failed our daughter, you were there for her. I can never thank you enough for that." Harry just nodded his head, not sure what to say in response to his words. "Molly and I talked at length before today, hoping that we would have a chance to talk with you both. More than anything else, we want you to come home, both of you. I promise there will be no questions asked. Whatever you two have been doing this summer or last term, it's not as important to us as the two of you yourselves. We just want our daughter, and you, Harry, back home with us." Harry could tell that this had been well rehearsed. And Mr. Weasley was definitely the right one to make this plea. While he loved the Weasley matriarch, she had a tendency to be overbearing and had difficulty treating her children as anything but the children she had spent so many years raising. Mr. Weasley, on the other hand, seemed to always know when to approach his children as a parent and when to approach them as adults, which only served to make it all the more difficult to say what needed to be said. "I can never thank you and Mrs. Weasley enough for all you've done for me," Harry stated honestly. "You've been more like parents to me than anyone else in my life, and I hope that I can always continue to count on you in that regard. However, as much as I love the Burrow and your family, I can't take you up on your offer." "Neither can I," Ginny added, and Harry could see the heartbreak in her parents' faces. "But," Mrs. Weasley burst out loudly, but Harry held up a hand for silence, simultaneously casting a quick privacy ward so as not to draw attention. "I know you like to think of us both as kids," Harry continued, "and maybe we are in some ways. But it doesn't matter. This war won't wait for us to grow up. Voldemort has been targeting students, my students, and I've made it my responsibility to protect them. I haven't been perfect, we wouldn't be here if I had. But I've done the best I can, and I'll continue to do so. And I'll continue to do everything I can to stop the Death Eaters and Voldemort from hurting any innocents. Maybe I shouldn't have to. Maybe this shouldn't be my responsibility. But the fact of the matter is, it needs to be done, and I'm the one who's doing it. I'm not leaving Harry. I may not be at his level," Ginny interjected as he trailed off, "but I'm well above any other students at Hogwarts, and I know I can hold my own against most of the Order members. I love you both, but this is something I need to do. You two may think you're all grown up, but you are still just kids," Mrs. Weasley stated, visibly reining in her emotions as her voice warbled dangerously. "You may not be our son, Harry, but you're as good as. And you, young lady, are our daughter. Our underage daughter. You may think you need to stay with Harry, and you may think you need to go out fighting Death Eaters, but that's not up to you. We are your parents, and we want you at home. We'd prefer it if you came willingly, but it is not up for discussion. Molly, we talked about this, Mr. Weasley interrupted with a stern note of warning in his tone. Oh yes, we talked about it, Mrs. Weasley responded, her voice becoming loud and shrill. We talked about approaching them as adults and allowing them to choose, counting on them to make the right decision. Well, they've made the wrong one, Arthur, and I will not stand here while my only daughter disappears again. We also talked about what would happen if they did not agree, if you will recall, he responded harshly, surprising Harry. He had never heard Mr. Weasley talk like that, especially not to his wife. He turned back to them and continued in his normal, calming tone, you have to understand that this has been very hard on us, and we want more than anything for you two to come home. I can certainly understand your reticence, and I know that no matter that you, Ginny, are still underage, we cannot truly force you to come home with us. That's not the way we want things. We don't want you to feel like a prisoner in your own home. Thank you, Daddy, Ginny replied, her voice oddly shy sounding. He smiled warmly if a twinge sadly and held his arms open. Harry let go of her hand as Ginny stepped forward into his embrace. Harry watched father and daughter for a moment before Mrs. Weasley's expression caught his eye. An immense sadness was painted across her face as she stared at the hug being shared between her husband and daughter. While her insistence upon coddling them as children frustrated him, he hated to see her looking so devastated. Harry's ears perked up as he heard the murmur of words being exchanged between the pair. He refrained from actively trying to listen in until they separated. As she left her father's arms, Ginny immediately turned to her mother. Mum, she said with a questioning lilt in her tone. For the second time that day, Mrs. Weasley hesitated. She focused her gaze on Ginny for a moment before finally her countenance cracked. A stifled sob escaped, and she stepped forward and encased Ginny in her warm embrace. Oh, Ginny, she cried. My darling baby, I will always love you. I just miss you so much and worry for you. Take care of her, Mr. Weasley stated from his side, and Harry was marginally startled at how close he was, having not noticed him walking up next to him. I will, Harry vowed, turning to look him in the eye. I love her, sir. I will not let anything happen to her. If there is one thing I trust, Harry, son, Mr. Weasley said, it is both your resolve and ability to do just that. Harry nodded gratefully, a little taken aback at the faith Mr. Weasley seemed to have in him. Turning back to the Weasley women, he found them just separating. I know we can't talk you into coming home for good, but maybe we can entice you into coming for dinner, Mr. Weasley said as he walked back to his wife's side, grasping her hand between both his own. I'll make all your favorites, Mrs. Weasley added. Harry smiled and turned to Ginny, seeing his own feelings mirrored in her eyes. When they turned back, Ginny said, we'd love that. Harry gripped Ginny's hand as her parents smiled at their acceptance. Something niggled in the back of his mind at that moment, and he took stock of himself and his surroundings. His eyes and ears revealed nothing, but a moment later he realized what it was. Neville's was no longer the only aura he could detect outside the manor. Ginny turned to him worriedly as he stiffened, and he uttered one word to her before bolting from the room. Neville. He sprinted out onto the grounds to find Neville standing guard over his grandmother's grave, shielding it and himself from blasting and bombarding curses from a trio of masked figures. In a brief lull in their fire, Neville was able to return with a stunner. The Death Eater was sluggish to respond to the attack and fell to the red spell. The other two continued their attack on Neville without paying any mind to their fallen ally. Harry sent a deluge of stunning spells towards the remaining two as Neville continued to shield. He managed to catch both of the remaining Death Eaters who made no move to defend themselves, no matter that they should have been able to see the spells coming in their peripheral vision. He slowed his all-out sprint into a jog as he continued towards Neville, who was huffing heavily as he remained standing with his wand held up in defense just in front of the freshly turned dirt of his grandmother's grave. Are you all right? Harry asked as he approached. Neville nodded. I'm fine, he said, still catching his breath. They didn't seem all that smart or skilled, just kept shooting spells at the grave. Harry nodded, having thought they were rather incompetent as well. Their lack of reactions to their return spells made him think there was more here than met the eye. A drone of voices caught his ear as other guests began pouring out of the manor, presumably following Harry's hasty departure. Leading the charge was Ginny, who had at least a 50-yard lead on the others. She slowed to a walk when it became apparent there was no danger left. "What happened?" she queried. Harry jerked his head to the three fallen figures. They were attacking the grave and not very mindful of anything else. "I have a feeling they were either new recruits or, more likely, under the Imperius." "Neville, Harry, are you all right?" Dumbledore asked as he strode up to them. Harry nodded as Neville replied, "Fine." The headmaster nodded as he continued past them towards the stunned Death Eaters. Harry immediately sprung into step beside him. "I suspect they're not real Death Eaters," he said as they came upon the bodies. Dumbledore turned and regarded him for a short moment before turning back to the Death Eaters. As he knelt down to remove the mask of one of them, Harry felt his necklace heat up. Grasping the cord in alarm, Harry turned around to see Ginny fingering hers as well. He met her eyes briefly before turning back to Dumbledore. "I have to go," he said, quickly rushing back to Ginny and Neville. "Stay here," he said to Neville and then turned to Ginny. "Meet you at the map." He apparated directly into his lounge, and Ginny appeared at his side a moment later. Tonks and Remus entered through the front door seconds later as his eyes locked in on the flashing name. Fred Weasley. Weasley's Wizarding Wheezes was under attack. Albus stared at the spot where two of his students had disappeared, frowning in worry. Given their actions, it was clear something had just occurred, perhaps another student was under attack. Harry obviously had some means of knowing when his students were in trouble. He had noticed the boy grabbing at the cord of a necklace before leaving in a rush. Glancing to the side, he noticed Remus and Nymphadora speaking quietly but urgently to one another. He suspected they were deciding whether leaving to help was worth giving themselves away. He intended to help make up their minds. Two quick, soft pops sounded, and Harry and Ginny reappeared. "Diagon Alley," Harry called, looking first to Remus and Tonks and then turning to meet his gaze. "I don't know how many there are," Harry confessed, "but I'd rather come with more force than necessary." Albus nodded his agreement even as he stifled his rising objections to the team's involvement in any fighting. They were well past the point where any of his arguments would do any good. Best to go along and do what he could to ensure they came to no harm. Turning to the gathering crowd of Order members, he ordered, "You heard the boy. Hestia and Sturgis," he picked out, "please remain here in case any other unwanted guests arrive." He glanced pointedly to the stunned trio by the gravesite to emphasize his intent. "The rest of you, to Diagon Alley, and be prepared for anything." Harry and Ginny were already gone as were Remus and Nymphadora. Without wasting another moment, Albus disapparated. He felt the wards blocking his intended destination and redirected the magic at the last instant, taking him to the alley outside the Leaky Cauldron. He strode purposely through the entrance to the pub and had to fight his way against the tide of people streaming in from Diagon Alley. Some used the flow to escape, while others disapparated as soon as they crossed the threshold out the door. The alley itself was not any less chaotic. People were running everywhere from the several groups of Death Eaters, each at least 5 strong. But what drew his attention was the figure standing amidst the chaos completely unaffected. Wand in hand but pointed casually toward the ground stood Tom Riddle, the self-appointed Dark Lord Voldemort. A series of small explosions drew his gaze to the side where, under the storefront proclaiming the sign, Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, dozens of spells erupted in every direction. Amidst the lights of the spells stood a group of 8 Death Eaters unprepared for the sudden onslaught. None of the spells were debilitating, but they would prove suitably distracting for the moment. Turning his attention back to more immediate concerns, he followed along the shadows of the storefronts towards a nearby group of Death Eaters. As long as Tom was abstaining from the battle, it would be best to take care of some of his underlings before he became aware of Albus' presence. An upward flick and jab of his wand brought some rubble off the ground surrounding the mob of dark wizards. He circled his wand around, forming a ring of steel that, with a sharp pull of his wand, contracted around the group, pulling them together into a knot and stealing their breath away. The moment of distraction was all he needed to summon their wands away. A red burst of light followed, and they summarily collapsed to the ground. Satisfied, he turned back to track Tom and startled upon finding that he had moved. A quick sweep of the alley showed numerous battles breaking out between newly arrived Order members and the Death Eaters, but he could not allow himself to be distracted by these skirmishes. Finally, he located his target standing out of the way in the mouth of an alley across from the Weasleys' store where a battle was taking place. His eyes widened as he realized exactly who was involved in that particular skirmish. Harry largely blended in with his surroundings, but the Weasley Red stood out. Not only was Ginny present at his side, but Messrs. Fred and George were as well. Fear growing in the pit of his stomach, he began marching down the alley towards the teens. He did not trust Tom to remain inactive for long. His gaze alternated between the teens and Tom as he strode down the alley. He had never seen any of them in battle before save for pensive memories of a young man he had only recently learned was, in fact, Harry. Somehow it was entirely different seeing for oneself the proficiency with which the young man wielded his magic without even the aid of a wand. His distraction was so complete that he nearly failed to react in time to the killing curse approaching at his side. A quick flick of his wand to raise a block of cement into the path of the spell saved his life, while a quick burst of wind prevented the shrapnel from tearing into his flesh. A negligent wand jab turned his attacker's robes to lead, and he distantly noted the thump of metal meeting the ground as he turned his focus back where it belonged. Too late. Tom was already approaching the battling teens. Pointing his wand to the ground, he released his magic as he traced his wand forward. A crack split the ground in front of him and followed the path of his wand as it spread under Tom's feet, halting his approach. The Dark Lord turned his head, and Albus met his crimson-eyed gaze. A malevolent smirk lit Tom's face as he dismissively turned away towards a nearby group of Death Eaters. Albus could just hear the order. "Keep the fossil busy while I attend to other matters." They immediately fanned out as they approached, preventing him from being able to target them as a group. Without any delay, he started on the offensive. He had to get to Tom before he could do any harm to Harry. "Harry Potter," a hissing voice addressed him as he knocked out another Death Eater. He froze in mid-stride for just a moment before turning to meet the hateful red glare of Voldemort and bit back a gasp as his already throbbing scar erupted in searing pain. He gritted his teeth as he glared at the facade of a man before him. This was not good. Fighting Death Eaters was one thing, but he knew he was not ready to face their master. But neither was he prepared to flee and leave innocents to suffer in his wake. "I'm surprised to see you, Tom," he finally responded, glancing quickly to each side. Ginny and the twins were still fighting a pair of Death Eaters on one side of him, and he noticed Dumbledore engaged with 8 or 10 of them a short distance down the alley on his other side. "Guess that just leaves me." He slipped his wand out of its holster on his arm. He had not used it in weeks, but he kept it strapped to his forearm out of sheer habit. While it would only slow him down in a normal duel, it was a weapon of a different sort against Voldemort, and he was grateful to have it with him. "That wand will not help you today, Harry," Voldemort dismissed with a sneer. "I expected I might run into you today and made the proper arrangements." Harry's eyes slid to the wand clasped in his enemy's hand. It was sad that he could spot immediately that it was not his usual wand, once he knew to look for it. Sighing, he slid his wand back up his forearm until it locked back into its holster. There was no sense using it since it was not a brother to Voldemort's new wand. "You have been very busy this summer," Voldemort noted casually. "Only as busy as your minions," Harry retorted, only too happy to continue the repartee if it gave Dumbledore a chance to finish off those Death Eaters and help. Voldemort laughed. "Yes, you've been surprisingly effective against even my experienced Death Eaters, but it is not they you must defeat, Harry. Come, boy, and meet your destiny." He raised his wand and quickly sent a Crucio. Harry was prepared for it and sidestepped easily, responding with a series of stunners and blasting hexes in reply. Voldemort laughed as he flicked each one out of the air with the tip of his wand. Surely the prophesized one can do better than that. He was alarmed at how disturbingly easy it seemed for Voldemort to counter each of his spells, not even needing to rely upon a shield to stop them. Harry knew he was being baited, Yet he also knew the longer he held Voldemort from truly attacking, the more time that would give Dumbledore to arrive, so he obliged. He kept up a constant stream of hexes and curses, varying them but not digging into anything too powerful. His aim was only to keep Voldemort distracted. It would not do to tempt him to attack. The rate of spells was quick enough that Voldemort was unable to dispel them one at a time. Instead, he idly raised a shield and stood behind it, staring impassively at Harry. "It is a neat trick," Voldemort stated even as Harry continued his relentless assault. "But you must realize you have no hope to harm me with mere schoolyard curses." His eyes slid past Harry, and his mouth quirked up into the semblance of a smile. "Look who has decided to join us. So lovely to see you again, my dear." Harry could feel Ginny's approach from behind him but kept his gaze on Voldemort. He was hesitant to warn her away as he did not want to call attention to her, but when he saw Voldemort's eyes slide past him he knew it was already too late. "Stay back," Harry yelled at her, futilely hoping in spite of everything he knew about her that she would listen. "I am not letting you do this alone," Ginny fired back. Voldemort laughed derisively. "Such a devoted lover, Potter, so willing to die at your side. I don't know what I shall ever do now that I must face the both of you. Do I use her to break you? Or do I force her to watch as I kill you once and for all? It's so difficult to choose." As Ginny continued her approach, Harry felt the pain in his scar begin to fade. When she stood level with Harry, he stepped in front of her, using one arm to hold her back while the other remained leveled at Voldemort. The moment his hand made contact with her, the last vestiges of pain in his scar vanished completely, and Harry felt almost lightheaded at its absence. Shaking his head, he glanced briefly at Ginny before turning his full attention back to Voldemort. "If you're not here to kill me, then what do you want, Tom?" he demanded. "Do not call me by that name," Voldemort hissed, raising his wand menacingly. "My apologies," Harry responded with a slight bow of his head. "I was under the impression we were on a first-name basis." He met Voldemort's glare as he waited, poised to spring aside and drag Ginny behind him the moment he struck, but, instead, the Dark Lord only laughed. "That's what I admire most about you, Harry. Defiant to the very end." He punctuated his last word with a jab of his wand, sending an unknown curse at him. Harry sidestepped, feeling Ginny move with him. He let go of her arm as he turned to face Voldemort fully. As soon as he let go, he felt the thrum of pain re-emerge in his scar. He pushed the pain and his confusion over it to the back of his mind as he concentrated on the spells being shot at him. He did not recognize a single one, and so he dodged out of the way as each curse approached. He sent some of the strongest curses he knew in return, but Voldemort seemed wholly unaffected by any of them. He swiped them out of the air with his wand even as he continued casting more and more curses. "How disgustingly Muggle of you, Potter. Stand still, and fight me like a wizard." Harry did not dignify him with a response. He continued his casting and added some transfiguration into the mix. A pair of wolves were incinerated before they could even manage to get near the Dark Lord. He sent bricks and blocks of concrete flying at Voldemort, but the Dark Lord stopped the projectiles in midair with ease and redirected them back at Harry. He quickly spelled the ground in front of him to rise up to shield him from the onslaught and darted out from behind the barrier not a moment too soon as it exploded behind him. "If you won't fight me properly, Potter, perhaps I'll have to find another to do battle with," Voldemort threatened as he turned his wand to Ginny, who had been ineffectively trying to curse Voldemort from his side. "No," Harry snarled, pushing his rage and fear into his magic as he cursed the Dark Lord. A pulse of white light left his outstretched hands and sped towards Voldemort, who quickly raised a shield. As the spell connected, there was a moment where he was sure the shield would fail, but it seemed as if Voldemort pulled magic from the very air around him to strengthen his shield and repel his spell out into the sky. And then he laughed as Harry sunk to a knee, suddenly feeling utterly drained. Now that was impressive, he complimented, and Harry actually believed that he was truly impressed. "But it would appear you have overextended yourself, Harry. A valiant attempt to save your girlfriend, but you are no match for Lord Voldemort. I tire of these games. Rise, Harry, and meet your end." "I'm afraid I cannot allow that, Tom," another voice chimed in. Harry did not think he would ever be more pleased to hear Dumbledore's voice. So, the old fool has finally decided to join the festivities, Voldemort mocked. You are slipping in your old age, Dumbledore. Potter could have died many times over by now, and then where would you be without a savior to pin your hopes on? Harry wearily rose to his feet as Dumbledore calmly replied, It would appear that Harry has managed just fine to this point, Tom. With a little more time and the proper training, I dare say he might even be your equal. Harry did not miss the prophetic reference. Ginny approached from his side and reached for his hand. As soon as she made contact, the pain in his scar once again vanished. Nobody is my equal, not you or this boy. Perhaps, Dumbledore responded noncommittally. You'll forgive me if I do not simply surrender my wand now, but I'll require you to prove that theory. He held his wand aloft, prepared to strike. I already have what I came for, Voldemort spat. I've taken the measure of your chosen one and found him lacking. Take your petty victory today, I've as good as won the war. With that he, as well as all his Death Eaters in the alley, disappeared with a whoosh of displaced air. The sudden silence of the alley was deafening. He turned to Ginny and looked her over carefully to confirm she was uninjured before facing the headmaster. Harry found himself at a loss as to what to say. Their avoidance of the issues earlier in the day seemed silly now in the wake of the destruction of the alley. Before he could come up with anything to say, Dumbledore beat him to the punch. Thank you for the warning, Harry, he stated gravely. I dare say even a delay of mere minutes would have left us with hardly an alley to salvage. Once again I find myself lagging sorely behind your efforts this summer. Harry nodded uneasily, swallowing his pride as he briefly surveyed the carnage surrounding them. I'm glad you were here. There were far too many Death Eaters, let alone Voldemort, for us to handle on our own. I believe, as you so ably put it, that it is high past time we began working with one another. We cannot afford to continue diverting our efforts away from our mutual objective. Harry nodded his head and refrained from pointing out that only one of them was wasting resources working against the other. I believe, before we can begin down that road, that I must apologize to the both of you for my treatment of you over the past months. As virtuous as my intentions may have been, my actions were misguided and reprehensible. Harry squeezed Ginny's hand in his, knowing she may not be ready to dole out any forgiveness just yet. I appreciate that, but now is probably not the best time for this conversation. We could meet tomorrow after things have calmed down some. Dumbledore frowned as his eyes swept through the alley. Yes, perhaps, you are right. Hogwarts, around lunchtime, Harry suggested. Yes, that would be agreeable. See you then, Harry confirmed, turning towards Ginny and jerking his head towards the twins who were standing outside the front of their shop surveying the damage. As they walked over to the pair, a nagging question he had been unable to ask in the heat of battle suddenly resurfaced in his mind. If you guys are both still here, then who used the portkey? The duo turned as one to regard them. Our customers. Everyone that was in the shop. When the first spell struck. Figured it would be bad for business. If we just let paying customers perish in our very store. Quite sensible, Harry agreed. Almost too sensible, Ginny inserted suspiciously. That's because it wasn't their idea, Angelina stated as she walked out of the store. They just wanted to take credit by using one of their own portkeys. You wound us, grievously. Our sole concern was with your own safety. If things went pear-shaped, we wanted to know that you'd have the means to escape. A fine way to repay our selfless act. I think you mean my selfless act, George. You still have your portkey. Touché, brother mine. I'm glad to see not even an attack by Voldemort himself can dampen your spirits, Ginny commented, and he thought he detected a hint of warning in her tone. Levity was all well and good, but the current situation was not one to treat so lightly. So that was him then? Fred asked, all traces of humor gone. I reckon you two fared all right against him, George added, a hesitantly hopeful note to his voice. He was playing with us, Ginny spat. Fred, George, and Angelina all turned to Harry, and he nodded seriously. Their expressions all soured. Let's go see if anyone needs any immediate help, Harry stated into the sudden somber silence. Then we can see about getting this place fixed up. By the time they finished up at Diagon Alley, picked Neville up, and returned home. Harry was about ready to drop. His fight with Voldemort, particularly that last spell, had really taken a lot out of him. After helping the wounded, cleaning up, and restoring the twins' shop, he had nothing left. He barely kicked his shoes off before collapsing into bed. When he awoke, Harry found a pair of brown eyes only inches away from his face. "Morning," Ginny greeted him with a dazzling smile. Morning," Harry answered, his voice gruff and groggy from sleep. As he began to take stock of himself, he realized that he was wearing nothing but his boxers. Glancing down, he found Ginny in a t-shirt, one of his t-shirts. Not that he minded one bit. "You undressed me," he stated as much to himself as to her. "Well, you were pretty much dead to the world as soon as you collapsed on the bed, and I figured you'd be more comfortable this way," she replied, running her fingers through his hair. "You didn't have your wicked way with me, did you?" he asked, mock defensively. "Because if you plan to sully my honor, I'd like to at least be conscious to properly enjoy the experience." She rolled her eyes. "Yes, you caught me. Or at least I tried. Seems little Harry was as dead to the world as Big Harry." "Well, he's as awake as Big Harry now," he answered with a waggle of his eyebrows. She slapped him lightly on the arm. "You know, as reluctant as you were the first few times, you're sure getting pretty bold nowadays." Her exasperated tone did not match her eyes. She hesitated a moment, and Harry grew hopeful. "But if we start that now, we may never get out of bed, and you've already slept in very late." Harry frowned grumpily. "What time is it?" 11 o'clock. "Damn, and as I recall you have a meeting with Dumbledore today," she added, and Harry nodded, having suddenly remembered the same. He let loose a long-suffering sigh, eliciting a snort of laughter from Ginny. He sat up and looked at her, waiting for her to stop laughing before asking, "Are you coming with?" She frowned and worried her bottom lip between her teeth. "I guess I probably should. It's just every time I see him, I still remember him trying to break into my mind, and it makes me so angry all over again." She huffed and turned away, her hands tightening at her sides. Harry rose and walked to her, wrapping his arms around her. "It's all right if you're not ready," he whispered into her hair. "No, it's not," she stated defiantly, spinning around in his embrace. "I'm in this every bit as much as you. The last thing I need is to give anyone any reasons to treat me like a child." "You're probably right," he agreed. "Of course I'm right." By the time the two of them had showered and dressed, they had time for only a quick bite to eat before leaving for their meeting. Apparating to the gate of the school, they set off down the path. After a few minutes, Harry caught sight of Hagrid just inside the tree line of the Forbidden Forest. "Hagrid," he called out, waving over his head as the half-giant looked in their direction. "Ari, Ginny," Hagrid called back, trotting in their direction. "Good to see you too." "You too, Hagrid," Ginny agreed. "How's your summer?" Harry asked. "Been all right. Two of you gave us a bit of a scare fair a bit, despairin' the way you did," the half-giant replied, a hint of reproach in his tone. Harry shrugged. "Guess I just needed to strike out on my own for once." Every goes through it, I suppose. Part of growing up," Hagrid agreed. Don't mean ye gotta leave every in the dark 'bout it either." Harry gave a sheepish shrug as he replied, "Given my rather unique circumstances, no amount of asking would have gotten me anywhere. I needed to prove I could not only keep myself safe from Voldemort but also hidden from Dumbledore and the Order as well. If I couldn't do that, then I probably wouldn't have been ready to be on my own anyway." True 'nough, Hagrid stated. "And hidin' from Dumbledore's no easy trick either. Just so long as ye don't forget who friends, and enemies are." He paused for a moment before taking a deep breath and adding, "Well, I've got work to be done. Don't be strangers now, "You got it, Hagrid," Harry said. "Bye Hagrid," Ginny added. "Goodbye, Ari, Ginny. You take care of, I am for me, he added to the latter. "Of course," Ginny replied with a wide grin. "Someone has to." The half-giant bounded back to the forest with a booming chuckle. As they ascended the steps rising up to the main entrance, the massive doors opened for them. As they strode into the entrance hall, they came face to face with their head of house. "Minerva," Harry greeted with a smile. "Professor," Ginny added. "Harry, Miss Weasley, I trust you two are well." "Still a little tired from yesterday," Harry said with a casual shrug of his shoulders. "Yes, quite an eventful day," McGonagall agreed as they began to walk towards the staircases. "How is Mr. Longbottom doing?" "He's holding up," Harry answered. "As well as can be expected, really." After a brief silence, Ginny spoke up. "Are you going to be joining us, Professor? If that is all right with the two of you," she queried, to which they both nodded. "Someone has to ensure Albus does not continue his rather impressive streak of colossal mistakes in his treatment of you two." "Have you talked with him about us?" Harry questioned. "Yes, several times since the letter you sent and several more since his reply and several more since yesterday," she replied with only the slightest bit of exasperation leaking into her tone. "Needless to say he is quite anxious to speak with you both." Harry frowned. "I can't decide if that's a good thing or a bad thing." Ginny shrugged. "It's hardly surprising. He's been desperate to find you ever since you left. Then it may surprise you that he is nearly as anxious about speaking to you as to Harry," Minerva added. Ginny shot the professor a confused glance before frowning and turning her head down in contemplation. They made the rest of the trip in silence until they reached the gargoyle guarding the entrance to Dumbledore's office. "Saltwater Taffy," the deputy headmistress spoke, causing the stone sentinel to spring aside. Harry shook his head at the headmaster's quirky passwords as they rode the rising spiral stairs to the top. "Come in," Dumbledore's voice called through the door. Harry followed Minerva into the office, which showed no signs of the abuse the room suffered during his last visit. "Harry, Ginny," he greeted each in turn. "Thank you for coming. I know my recent transgressions against the both of you have given you little reason to trust me, so I thank you for giving me this opportunity to begin on the road to making amends." He paused briefly, and Harry met the headmaster's gaze squarely before the wizened wizard turned his eyes to Ginny. After another moment of silence, he swept his hand towards the chairs in front of his desk, saying, "Please, make yourselves comfortable." After they had seated themselves, Dumbledore spoke again. "I would like to start by apologizing to the both of you. My actions against you both were appalling. Harry, I had neither right nor even a valid reason to assault you. While my intent was merely to quickly subdue you before any drastic actions were taken, I see now that my own actions were rather drastic themselves. As your headmaster, casting any offensive spell at you is an appalling transgression, one that I will never repeat." He held Harry's gaze for a long moment before turning his attention to Ginny. "Miss Weasley, as horrible as my actions towards Harry were in this school, what I attempted to do to you in your own home far outstrips them. The mind magics are a delicate and dangerous art, and any abuse of them is not to be taken lightly. My actions were inexcusable regardless of my intentions, and for that you have my sincerest apology." A heavy silence followed, filled only with the deep breath released by the headmaster following his apologies. With his head down, he appeared to collect himself for a moment before looking up at his guests. "If I might begin with a question that has been niggling at my brain all summer." Harry nodded. "I'll not ask where you learned to make portkeys, as, while their creation is restricted by the ministry, the method of their creation is no great secret. But I must know, how do you keep track of when and where each portkey is activated?" Harry amusedly noted the eagerness in the headmaster's voice as he sat at attention awaiting his response. "You're familiar with the Marauder's map?" he queried. Dumbledore nodded. "A most excellent bit of magic. I dare say the Marauder's crowning achievement." Harry smiled. "I couldn't agree more. Over the school year, I studied the map and recreated it, even added additional features to it. It was the map that gave me the idea. I tied the portkeys into a map of Great Britain. The name on each portkey was locked in as soon as each student first touched theirs, which seemed to be the largest hurdle in applying the Marauder's map to a larger scale. At the start of summer, I scouted out the locations of each portkey on the map so that if and when the time came, I would know where to go. When a portkey is activated, an alarm goes off on the map, and I tied my necklace into the alarm using a derivation of the Protean charm, so I'll know as soon as it goes off even when I'm out." "Marvelous," Dumbledore commented. "Might I have a look at this map of yours?" Several members of the Order have been quite vocal in their desire to adopt your methods. I've just recently been convinced to supply all members with emergency portkeys, but we were unaware of how exactly you were tracking their use. I'll make you a copy, Harry stated, and show you how to add new portkeys. You have my gratitude and that of the entire Order, Dumbledore softly intoned. He paused a moment, seeming to build himself up to something, before continuing. While we are on the subject of the Order, a meeting was held last night following the attack on Diagon Alley. You were one of the main topics of discussion of the meeting, and, after consulting the other members, I would like to take this opportunity to offer you, the both of you, membership into the Order of the Phoenix. Harry stared at the headmaster a moment and deliberately blinked his eyes. Thank you, sir, but no thanks, he said into the silence. Ginny nodded, adding, I'm with Harry. Dumbledore appeared gobsmacked. Surely you don't mean. With all due respect, Headmaster, Harry cut in, you don't exactly have the best track record when it comes to your dealings with either one of us. Do you honestly think we intend to join up with an organization you run so that you can go back to trying to keep us in the dark and out of the war? Harry had never seen the headmaster so perplexed. I'm afraid you have me at a loss. In your letter you explicitly stated that we need to be united to win this war. That is a sentiment I share wholeheartedly, which is why I do not understand. I said we needed to work together, Harry corrected. And I meant it. I'd like to work with the Order, pool our resources, share information. But I will not put myself in a position where you or anyone else can decide what my role in this war will be. I see, Dumbledore stated. This changes things. And while we're on the subject, Harry added, waiting for Dumbledore to nod before continuing, I've been training Fred and George as well as Lee Jordan, Katie Bell, and Angelina Johnson. And now Neville is joining in as well. They're not battle-ready yet, but I would reserve the right to include them in any meetings we attend and, when I deem them ready, battles. Do you believe yourself ready for that responsibility? Dumbledore asked and held up a hand when Harry moved to respond. Please, think about it for a moment. I can respect that you want to help your friends train and that they may wish to involve themselves in the war, but are you personally ready for the consequences should harm befall any of them? Leading soldiers into battle is difficult enough, but when those soldiers are your friends, it is not a fate I would wish upon you. To be honest, it terrifies me, Harry admitted, that my decisions could cost them their lives. I have no idea what I would do with myself, but I can't refuse them. I've been in their shoes. I've been pushed to the side, told to be a good boy and let the adults handle it. I've seen where that leads. If they are determined to fight in the war, they will do so with or without my help. I would much rather teach them all I can and be in a position to stop them from going into battle until they are more capable of helping and, more importantly, surviving. Perhaps you could reach a compromise, Minerva interjected. Harry turned to her, his eyebrow lifted in question. Harry has proven himself to be an excellent instructor. Allow him to train his own people, but before they participate in battle, have them participate in mock duels against members of the Order to determine their levels of ability. Harry shared a quick smile with Ginny, whom he had forced to duel both Tonks and Remus before he was willing to take her into battle. A wonderful suggestion, Professor McGonagall, Dumbledore praised before turning his attention to Harry. What say you, Harry? I agree, Harry said. In fact, I think it would be beneficial if we could occasionally borrow different Order members to practice against. It always helps to get different people with different skill sets, so they can learn to adapt to different styles of dueling. The headmaster's tense posture seemed to relax at his agreement, and some of the light returned to his usually bright-eyed gaze as he responded, Excellent. Am I correct in assuming you would like to continue their training into the school year? Harry nodded. Would you like to include them in your existing classes, or will you be needing to make additional time for them? Dumbledore queried. I fear any additions could have a detrimental effect on your studies as your schedule was already full as it was last year. Actually, Harry stated, glancing briefly to Ginny, that's another thing I wanted to talk to you about. I don't really think the standard Hogwarts curriculum has anything left to offer us. For the second time in as many minutes, Dumbledore's face froze into an expression of abject surprise and confusion. Professor McGonagall, meanwhile, leaned forward in her chair and exclaimed, you can't mean to drop out of Hogwarts. We would still like to stay in the castle over the term, Harry added into the silence. And I want to continue teaching, both my students from last year as well as several sessions a week with Fred and George and the others. But to be honest, I did not get much of anything out of classes last year and don't think they will be any more beneficial to me this year. Ginny's not quite at my level, but she's beyond where I was when I started the term last year. The way we use magic is just too different from the rest of the students for classes to offer us anything. Using a wand and incantation can help us in learning new spells, but magic for us is much more instinctive and... I really don't have the words for it. Using a wand becomes a hindrance for spells I'm familiar with. I have to consciously try to channel my magic through the wand rather than just channeling the spell on my own. And learning new spells is a completely different experience. We can feel our magic reacting, feel when it begins to struggle with a new spell. It makes learning new spells so much more intuitive. I see, the headmaster replied in a distant tone. It is not unprecedented for a student to take certain NEWT examinations early over the summer. Typically it is only a single class that the student is far ahead in and wishes to remove it from his or her course load. He paused and surveyed the two of them. Do you feel you would be able to pass your NEWT examinations at this time? Harry frowned. If given a list of topics covered on the exams, I think I could probably be ready by the end of summer, he finally stated. And what of Miss Weasley? Dumbledore queried. Harry turned to Ginny. She met his gaze and shrugged. You'd probably know better than I would, she told him. She could probably be ready for the spell-centric courses. Defense, Transfiguration, and Charms, Harry finally decided. She'll need to cram the theory heavily this summer, but she could probably ace the practicals with only a week of preparation. You do realize, Harry, that if you are no longer taking courses, you will need to move out of the dorms and will not be eligible to play Quidditch, Minerva inserted. Harry turned to her. As much as I love Quidditch, there are too many other more important things going on right now. Missing Quidditch is the least of my concerns. As for the dorms, he turned his attention back to the headmaster. I was rather hoping I could take you up on your offer from last year of my own quarters. And I was hoping I could join him, Ginny added with a small smirk. Minerva deliberately cleared her throat at that but kept silent at a look from the headmaster. Again, it is not unheard of for two students to share quarters. It has been done in the past with two students who were of age and married. You, however, are not married, and Miss Weasley is not of age. I'm afraid there is nothing I can do to help you. Miss Weasley will still be taking courses, and as such will remain a student. You could make her another assistant professor, Harry interjected. Give us both our own quarters. So that you may ignore them and sleep together. Minerva questioned. I am not at all comfortable endorsing such behavior, and I guarantee Molly Weasley will share the sentiment. It's not what you think, Harry stated. At their unconvinced looks he added, well, there is that too, but it's much more than that. I don't think I can actually sleep without Ginny. What do you mean you cannot sleep without her? Minerva demanded. I had a lot of trouble sleeping last term. I rarely made it through a full night of sleep without being interrupted by a vision from Voldemort. I made a habit of taking naps in my office with Ginny. She would read or do her homework, and I'd rest my head in her lap while I slept. It was the only time I slept soundly. Things got worse this summer. I was barely sleeping at all, and it was beginning to take its toll. I even snuck into the burrow one night to sleep with Ginny. But ever since she came to live with me, I haven't had a single vision. I've slept soundly every single night. Harry shared a brief smile with Ginny and reached out for her hand. Intertwining their fingers, he turned his attention back to the headmaster. When you told me the prophecy, you said that the power I have that Voldemort knows not, is love. I thought you were crazy at first, but now I think I'm starting to believe. In Diagon Alley yesterday, my scar flared up in pain as usual whenever Voldemort is near, but the closer Ginny was to me, the less my scar hurt. He paused and shared a lingering glance with Ginny. He had briefly mentioned the occurrence to her yesterday, but with all that had been going on they had not had a chance to sit down and talk about it. He shook himself out of his reverie and refocused on the headmaster as he continued, when she touched me, even just as simple as this, He held up their joined hands. The pain vanished completely. I don't know how, but Ginny shields me from him, from my connection to him. For the first time during their meeting, the customary twinkle in the headmaster's eyes returned in full force. This is most certainly heartening news. However, I fear it is not as simple as you would like to believe. All assistant professors must be approved by the Board of Governors, and your appointment last year was difficult enough to manage. It was only Professor Caldwell's request for an assistant that gave me the additional leverage needed to make it a reality. With you intending to continue your role, I'm afraid there is no pressing need for another assistant and therefore no reason for the Board of Governors to approve Miss Weasley's appointment. Isn't there any way to justify having her own rooms without being an assistant professor? Harry queried. A heavy silence fell over the room for a long moment as all occupants were lost in their own thoughts. What about independent study? Ginny suddenly posed into the silence. Harry and the two professors turned their attention to her as she continued. We were hoping to convince a few professors to give us private lessons, and even though I won't be taking all my newts this summer, I think my time might be better served putting those other courses on hold and concentrating on more important things. Has there ever been a graduate who returned to school to study privately? The two professors shared a pointed look before the headmaster returned his attention and responded, as a matter of fact, yes, there is a precedent for such situations, and those students were considered separate from the house system and were given private quarters. If you are certain about this decision, and assuming you do receive passing newt results in at least 3 courses this summer, I perceive no problems with granting your request. You will, however, require parental permission due to your status as a minor. Harry shared a look with Ginny, glad that they had already made some strides towards reconciliation with her parents. Their upcoming dinner at the Burrow would serve as a prime opportunity for Ginny to broach the topic. He could only hope that her parents would be agreeable towards the request, though he would be sure not to mention the underlying reason for Ginny needing her own quarters. The headmaster cleared his throat, and, after Harry had returned his attention to the man, he added, appearances must be kept, of course. Officially, the two of you will have separate quarters. Discretion will also be required. However, if I am not mistaken, I believe there are 2 adjacent guest quarters on the 6th floor which contain a hidden passage connecting them. We will expect the 2 of you to be responsible, Minerva inserted pointedly. It was clear from her expression that she was still not entirely comfortable with the situation. And if word gets out to the student body of your situation, these privileges can and will be revoked. Harry nodded his head. It was not as though he would be bragging about it in the corridors. Then it is settled, the headmaster stated. If Harry and Ginny thought their summers had been busy already, they were in for a rude awakening. Revising for newts on top of all their other training left little to no time for leisure. It was several days before Ginny finally sat down to write her parents about having supper at the Burrow. She suggested they have the supper on her birthday, which was less than a week away. She knew it would mean a lot to her parents to celebrate with the whole family. While part of her just wanted to spend the day alone with Harry, she also missed her family and genuinely wanted to see everyone again. She just hoped they were ready to accept her living situation with Harry, otherwise, it would not be a pleasant evening. It felt like she barely blinked before the day arrived. She woke up to the smell of breakfast as Harry walked into the room with a tray full of all her favorites. It was only after she was halfway through the meal that she noticed she had overslept. When she questioned Harry about it, he explained, I thought I'd let you sleep in on your birthday. In fact, I insist that you take the whole day off. We can just relax and do whatever you'd like with the afternoon before heading to the Burrow this evening. She was hardly going to complain at that. Truth be told, they both really needed the day off, though Harry confessed that he did go through his usual morning ritual before showering and cooking her breakfast. Still, it was nice just to be normal for a little while, without worrying about training and fighting and Death Eaters and Voldemort. It was with a fair bit of trepidation that Harry and Ginny apparated into the yard of the Burrow. The house looked as it always did, strange and lopsided and seemingly standing due only to the magic holding it all together. And yet, for all that the building remained the same, the feel of the place had changed completely. Since Harry first arrived in Mr. Weasley's flying Fort Anglia during the summer after first year, the Burrow had always been a place of wonder. It was filled with some of the most odd and downright whimsical things he had ever seen in his life, but more than that, the home had always been full of family and love. The events of the summer had tarnished those feelings. The burrow had always been somewhat of an ideal to him, a window into what his life could have been like had Voldemort never killed his parents. It had filled him with a pang of heartache accompanied by a sense of wonder that, while he may not have been given the chance to grow up with his parents or with brothers and sisters, he was a part of a family. They did not share blood or even a name, but never had he ever felt like an outsider at the burrow. Until this summer. As they approached the back door, Harry shook these thoughts from his head. What happened earlier this summer was terrible, but it was also in the past. This visit was meant to be about putting all that behind them. Dwelling about it now would certainly be no help in that. As they reached the door, Harry shared a lingering, uncomfortable glance with Ginny. Here they were standing outside the door to her home, his surrogate home, and they were unsure how to proceed. Should they knock or just let themselves in? Shrugging his shoulders, Harry lifted his hand and rapped his knuckles against the solid wood door. Not 2 seconds later the door was flung open, and in the frame of the doorway stood the force of nature known as Molly Weasley. Her eyes lit up upon seeing them and she descended upon them, grabbing each in one arm and pressing them into a tight three-way hug. "You never need to knock at this house," she said to them, keying the top of her head in his cheek. "Both of you. This is your home, and it always will be, no matter how much time may pass or how far away life takes you. This door is always open to you." And with a statement as simple as that, all those feelings that had been startlingly vacant upon their arrival began creeping back in. There was still some awkwardness as the greetings went around. Bill and Charlie, particularly, were less than warm when addressing Harry, though he could certainly see where they were coming from. Had he a younger sister who had run off to live with her boyfriend, Harry could not say he would be entirely friendly to the bloke either. Conversation was not entirely natural and flowing. The big erumpent in the room was being carefully avoided by all parties, though some were better at ignoring its existence than others. Every time someone, usually her mother, Bill, or Charlie, would encroach on the subject only to suddenly, awkwardly change gears, he could see Ginny repressing the urge to act. Whether to yell or curse he could not say. But with the twins, Arthur, and surprisingly Ron all doing their best to keep conversation moving along, those awkward moments were easily forgotten. For his part, Harry tried not to let any of it get to him. It was past time that the Weasleys were reunited, and he was certainly not going to do anything to get in the way. Harry was still unsure what to make of the new Ron, but what he had seen so far certainly seemed a vast improvement. There was no jealousy or irritation, expressed or repressed, from what he could tell. Ron, for once, seemed to be at peace with himself and his life. For the first time, Harry began to see some of his father's calm, affable nature emerge in him. He knew not exactly what brought about the change, but Harry began to hope that just maybe he would not end up losing the first friendship he had ever made. Ginny asked to speak with her parents alone after supper, and Harry helped herd her brothers out into the backyard to enjoy what little sunshine remained in the day while she explained her plans to take 3 of her newts this summer and sought permission to drop the rest of her courses to study independently. When she came out into the backyard several minutes later with a large smile on her face, Harry knew the conversation had gone well and could not help but smile widely in return. Harry relaxed into his chair as Ron stared down at the chessboard contemplating his next move. He watched Ginny as she laughed at something Charlie had said. He knew she had been worried about how the night would go, and while everything was not sunshine and roses, he was immeasurably pleased to see her like this, at ease with her family. His reverie was interrupted when Ron said, "I'm glad, you know." Harry shifted his attention from Ginny to Ron. "Huh. You and Ginny," he explained. "I know I was a bit of a prat about it at first, but I'm glad you're there for her. And she for you. You guys are good for each other." Harry could not help but catch the wistful tone in his voice. "I heard that things didn't work out between you and Hermione," he stated, wondering whether or not it was wise to bring up the subject. It was odd to think that they had not spoken of it. He had not even known about it until Ginny told him during the summer, though even she was unsure of the cause of their split. Ron met his gaze for a long moment before shrugging his shoulders. "Your move," he pointed out, inclining his head towards the board where he saw that one of his bishops had been taken. Harry decided to take the hint and drop the subject as he focused on his next move and was therefore surprised when Ron spoke. "I don't think we ever would have worked." There was no hint of sadness in his tone, just a frankness that Harry rarely heard from his friend. His curiosity nearly led him to asking Ron why he thought that, but in the end he held his tongue and picked up his other bishop and took one of Ron's rooks. He immediately dropped his head into his hands, shaking it back and forth as his bishop fell to a pawn he had somehow overlooked. Ron smirked. "I think it was the fact that she seemed so unattainable," he stated matter-of-factly. "I think a lot of my problems stem from that. I always want what I can't have, or think I can't have, at any rate. I look at what others have, and I decide I want it. I didn't even really start to like Hermione that way until she went out with Krum. I just get so focused on what I don't have, that I lose sight of what's right in front of my face." At that, he cast his gaze around the room, taking in his family. He turned back to Harry with a sober look on his face. "You're a good friend, Harry. More than that, your family, my brother. I'm sorry that I've lost sight of that at times." The chessboard lay forgotten as Harry regarded the gangly redhead sitting across him. "I'm sorry too," he said thickly. "I'm sorry for keeping everything from you over the past year. I wanted so badly to tell you." "You don't need to do that," Ron interrupted with a wave of his hand. "You could have told me, yes, but I wasn't ready then. I don't know how I would have handled it all, but I know now that I wasn't ready. I think had I known the full extent of what you could do, how much you had accomplished, no matter how hard you had to work for it, I just would have seen one more thing someone else had that I didn't. I realize now that I'm the lucky one. You've told me before, but it never really registered until recently. I was born to all of this." He waved his hand around the room. "I've had this all my life. You haven't. You didn't have any of this for a long time. But you do now. And if that girl you can't seem to tear your eyes away from for more than 2 minutes has anything to say about it, I imagine you'll never have to live without this again." Harry's eyes snapped back from where they had briefly wandered of their own accord back to Ginny and could not help the smile that stretched across his face. He stood up and clasped Ron on the shoulder and looked him in the eye as he stated, "You are a good friend, Ron. Never doubt that." A moment of silence passed as Harry let go of Ron's shoulder and turned his attention back to Ginny. "Whoa there, Romeo. Don't think you're getting out of this so easily, we've got a game to finish." Harry glanced back to the forgotten chessboard and heaved a sigh as he retook his seat. This should not take long. Chess had never been his strong suit, least of all when a stunning distraction lay mere meters away. Shaking his head, he refocused on the game board and proceeded to get his ass kicked. To be continued. I hope you enjoyed this story. Also remember to subscribe and like this video. See you in the next video.